Welcome to the Empowered Curiosity podcast. Today's kind of a fun experience for me because I'm out here in the woods with one of my favorite people, and Jenna is a dear friend of mine, also a colleague, also the photographer behind a lot of the pictures that I share on Instagram. And we decided to record a podcast episode together, but instead of doing it in like a dreary Vancouver apartment, we decided to come out to Golden Ears Park and just hang out in the woods. I really think about these woods as being like our woods because I've really only come here with you.
Oh, I love that.
So if you are visually inclined, you might want to check out the YouTube video instead of the audio version because you get to see all the beautiful surroundings that are around us. So,
Right.
yeah. So this is the awkward part where I kind of introduce you, and then you're gonna have to fill in the blanks a bit.
Okay. Awkward is my specialty.
Yep. So Jenna is a wonderful photographer. I hired you, what was that, 2018 or so?
Sure.
To take some photos for me as I was really starting to think about getting into coaching. It was like one of the first steps that I took towards like, okay, I'm gonna invest in like putting myself out there. And I decided I didn't want to let you go after we had our session, so now we're friends. And every
Does
time
the podcast like when I crack my knuckles in it?
I...
Sorry, Andre.
So yeah, we've been friends ever since. And I wanted to bring you on specifically to talk about boundaries in entrepreneurship. This idea was kind of sparked because you sent me a picture of your office when you were still back in the traditional workforce, of like a big sparkly banner across your office cubicle that says boundaries.
Champagne pink to be
Yeah.
full sparkles. Bought during a fever-induced thought pattern.
Like looking back on a lot of our conversations, it's like we have circled around boundaries, like just in our own personal conversations, it has circled around boundaries a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope you're proud of the boundaries that you have sort of put into place in the last year. So I've been watching a different kind of Jenna emerge.
Yeah.
And
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating process.
Yeah.
I don't think this is where I thought I was going to land,
Yeah.
but I'm glad this is where I ended up.
Yeah. And so I thought it'd be really fun as you're like in this process of emerging out of your chrysalis of boundaries.
In my goo.
Yeah. To like pick your brain a bit about what the process has been like and what's been helpful and what's been not helpful along the way. So
Okay. I like it.
anything to add in terms of like what you want to share about what you do, like what your work is like, so that people have a bit of context before we jump into the boundaries conversation?
Oh, okay. In relation to this conversation, my work is pretty creative, and as someone who, a decade or so ago didn't even know they were a creative, it's been both an incredibly rewarding process to sort of be seen for the way you see the world, but also this very interesting raw process too of I'm very much sharing the way I see the world and who I am, and trying to navigate how much do you share while still keeping it true to your own form. I think that's probably the way I would say that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the way that you take photos is really different from a lot of photography that I see out there. And I think that, the other day when we were having ramen, something I reflected back to you is, I've really appreciated how, you've held boundaries for the art the whole way through.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. That's a work in progress, and I don't know where that's going to land, but that is something that I hear within my own sort of thought process, own sort of creating where I'm taking this business to next is, despite the fact of I may not know what the logistics look like, it's incredibly important for me to never create for a reason outside of the creativity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that makes sense, but
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think a lot of times when the work is so personal to you,
mm-hmm.
and I don't necessarily think of what I do as coaching as being a wholly creative process, but there is this like desire to make sure that you're holding that in integrity. And I feel like it's really similar to how I've heard parents speak of boundaries, is
Hmm.
like it's kind of hard to hold boundaries for yourself, but like you'll step in and be like mama bear for your kid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
I had never thought about it that way, but yeah, I feel that way of like it's just I can't always vocalize where that boundary is, but there's like a raw, innate, natural reaction of like, nope, nope,
mm-hmm,
we're not going down that road. I don't know why. I don't know why I'm reacting so strongly to this,
mm-hmm,
but yeah, there's a need for me of I don't have many things in my life that allow me to get into that state of flow, and that almost, I mean, I think the word birth would work.
mm,
Of like, there aren't a lot of things in my life, productivity wise, work wise, where I get to the end of it and I'm like, this? I created this?
mm,
And so I think that that's why I'm so protective about it, is because it almost feels like something, it's me, but it almost feels like something that's transmuting through me
mm-hmm,
versus something where I've designed a system and step A is this, step B is this, and the logical outcome is this.
mm-hmm.
I think that that's probably why I'm so protective about it, of willing, I think I'm willing to sacrifice the sort of like big end result that you're supposed to want
Mm,
to ensure that I maintain its integrity.
yeah.
Of like, I would rather it have its integrity and not become something marketable or giant or whatever that end goal might be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think the thing that's coming up for me as you're talking about this is this idea of like this is such a businessy term, so I don't really want to use this word, but for lack of vocabulary, we're gonna have to just go with it.
Okay.
Of like niching,
Mm-hmm.
because you know, like I've said, your work is really different. You're not for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so, somebody might hear a photographer and think, oh, can you take pictures of my wedding? Can you take pictures
Yes.
of my kids? Can you, there's going
Exactly.
to be a lot of things where people think, oh, you're a photographer. Can you please do this thing for me and
Yeah.
provide this service for me? And so, how has niching been for you, like as you've sort of moved through your journey of entrepreneurship? And can you speak to that a bit?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think for me, I've definitely tried to be all the things for all the people, and that's the way you should diversify and all those shoulds.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an actual noticeable difference in what I can create.
Mm.
And there are people out there who that's their sweet spot. When they do weddings, when they do families, when they do newborns, you see, that that's their element.
Yeah.
And so it's not that those situations are the reason that can't come alive in that way, but it's not aligned for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, to be fair, I've had one or two examples where I've been like, oh, in the right circumstance with the right people, I really can work there, but that's not my wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some trial and error and doing things and sort of feeling some red flags and pushing through for whatever reason, of because I really cared for the person and I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
but this is really important for them.
Yeah.
And then not being able to produce, or even just a financial reason, right? Of
Yeah.
like, I think for me, that's always been my main protection around my art,
Mm.
is that I refuse to turn it into a hustle.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of means a multitude of things for me, including like being very transparent about how slow and storytelling my process is to
Mm-hmm.
get to the end of, I'm not your sort of run and gun photographer, and I'm not somebody who you can contact me 2 weeks before something and you're going to get that same sort of feeling out of.
Yeah.
But yeah, coming back to the niche question, I think for me, it's just a lot of trial and error. And I think ultimately, when it comes down to it, I started out with a little bit more like aggression and fire in the way I used to tell people this. But as somebody who has chosen not to get married, has chosen not to have kids, and all those sort of traditional reasons that people get photos for, my original fire of wanting to do this was, when do I get to have those milestone photos? And like, when do I get to celebrate and have these incredible sort of memories to look back on?
Yeah.
And so I think that that's how it started, and I think that there's a thread of that through the type of people I work with of it's not that it can't follow those traditional milestones, but there has to be another element to the story.
Absolutely. And I think that that's why, you know, it felt so aligned when I decided to work with you initially, because 2018 is when I started being like, ooh, I really want to think about moving away from acupuncture. I didn't get a chance to do that until 2020, but like it did feel a bit like a birth process of like, I'm birthing this new idea into the world. I came to you with this idea of like, can we have a couple of photo shoots where we are in nature and we are sort of playing with each of the elements. And so we had a photo shoot for water and a photo shoot for wood and one for metal, and you know, and I think that this is something that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with, is wanting to be everything for everyone, and like sort of tapping into their inner people pleaser, and feeling like that pressure of, like you were saying earlier, of like, oh, but I really want to do this for this particular person because I really like them, or I'm good at this thing, and I feel obligated to put this service out into the world. And you know, I feel like when we sort of play with that people pleaser part of us, that's where we can start having a bit of clarification around, this is for me, these are my people, these are the kinds of work that I want to do. And yes, I might be good at X, Y, and Z. You know, for me, a big sort of like thing I had to come to terms with is like, I am actually really good at acupuncture. And just because I'm good at that thing doesn't mean that I'm obligated to share that thing with the world.
Right. Or do it forever. Yeah. No, that definitely. And I think that that is part of why my process is so slow too, because there's almost like an interview process where I feel like clients are sussing me out and I'm sussing them out. And just really learning to sort of trust those initial reactions of, you know, this is somebody who gets it, who's aligned, whose storyline. And maybe it's not even so much about them as like, I have to ask a bunch of questions and get a bunch of layers so that a storyline forms in my head. And sometimes somebody's story can be incredible and it just doesn't land the same way with me, and or the way I've interpreted is not the way they want to tell it. And I think I've had to learn through a lot of trial and error of not to force that. And just because it's not this story doesn't mean we can't work together down the road in a different way. But there's lots of stuff that kind of has to suss out. And even my sessions in general, there's just a lot of play to them, right? It's less sort of choreographed and or posed. It's just, we're going to go to a location, and if that light and that location and that feeling works out, then we'll stay there for as long as that works out. But if it doesn't, then we'll go to a different one and figure it out.
So I imagine that through this process of really getting clear on the kinds of stories that you want to tell, you know, I've felt this too, and like the kinds of work that I want to do, you know, the kinds of problems that I want to help people solve, or, you know, the things that I want to support, is you've had to say no along the way.
Yep. And sometimes like say no once you've already said yes, which like just, if the people pleaser in me is just like, no, you made a promise, you must honor it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that I've really had to learn of, like, just because it was yes doesn't mean it has to stay yes. Or just because it
Mm-hmm.
was no doesn't mean that that opportunity is not coming down the road in an even more aligned, better circumstance.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that that's still something that's. I want things like in my mind. I'm like, well, I've said something, it's done, chapter closed. And that's not necessarily how the world works.
Yeah.
And so, in my mind, I want everything to be very resolute, black and white, yes or no, whatever. I want there to be like a clear division.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's less shocking now that I've gone through it multiple times, but there's still that moment of like, oh yeah, there's a lot more nuance to this. And there's a lot more of like, you have to reiterate it and you have to retest whether that boundary is still the boundary you want to hold.
Yeah.
And I think that there's still an element of surprise for me every time I run up against something where I'm like, it's not what I said.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, but that doesn't mean the story closes. It
Yeah.
just means you have to reiterate it and say something else and ask some more questions. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what does that feel like? I guess in your body is the first place that I go to. Of like, I'm imagining like an inner battle between your people pleaser and like the true and authentic no that's coming from like a wise place. So what does that feel like, and how does the authentic and wise no end up winning these days for you?
I think for me, it's a lot of just not being reactive. I think that that's like my ongoing life lesson of like it's okay to have a reaction, but like maybe you don't need to share your immediate thought because it's
Mm-hmm.
never my immediate thought is always black and white. It's like yes, no,
Mm-hmm.
and or this is how it's going to be. And if I let it settle a little bit, it comes out to a much softer place. Like I think that and or is very like clenched and very like reactive and
Yeah.
pushing. That's what it feels like in my body. Whereas when I come back to a more nuanced both and or no but
Mm-hmm.
instead of just a hell no, it feels so much different in my body. Like I almost feel like I can feel myself like shifting, right? Whereas like a hell no is like me leaning forward completely off my like
Mm-hmm.
balance point.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I just give some time to let it settle and be like, okay, what's the nuance, what's the context, what else might be true in this circumstance, then I can come at it in a much truer way. And I
Yeah.
feel like my words also sift out. Like
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a much better communicator in writing than even speaking,
Mm-hmm.
just because I feel like when I can read it and see it in front of me, I can be like, that is true, but there's also this. And like
Mm.
it feels like a settling of like murky waters.
Yeah.
And then everything settles out and you're like, oh, it's still there.
Yeah.
But it's just not quite as muddy.
Yeah. So that pause is really important for you.
Yeah. Still learning it, but very important. Still learning not to react and send my first response. And I think that that's what I'm really realizing too, in terms of, I sort of think of like my inner home world, my creative world, as completely different than like the external world that we all have to live in.
Mm-hmm.
And I get so wrapped up in the rules, which may only exist in my brain, of like immediacy. You need to do it. You need to have a response. You need to be on. You need to react. That sometimes I forget that it's completely okay to, take 2 days to respond to an email.
Yeah.
And it's unsettling still a little bit to me internally, but I'm really even trying to just do that for myself of like,
Mm-hmm.
even when it's something great or something, that's misaligned, I'm just trying not to respond, of being like, oh, I got that email yesterday, I'll respond to that tomorrow
Yeah.
when I'm in a place that has had some time to suss this out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what you're speaking to is something that I have been trying to like put into words of like reactions can come from both, like we automatically go to the bad place of
Mm-hmm.
like I'm reacting from a bad place.
Yeah.
I think that there's dysregulation that happens in the positive realms as well.
Hmm.
So, like, when you get the thing that
Mm-hmm.
you've been wanting and
Mm-hmm.
have been working for,
Mm-hmm.
that can also be like, whoa, in your
I
nervous
agree.
system. And, like,
Yeah.
I think that the wisdom that you shared there of, like, okay, taking a minute to respond, even if it's a good thing,
Yeah.
because even in that space, that can come from a reactionary space
Mm-hmm.
and not come from a group like a
Well,
rooted and grounded
and I
place.
feel like at least my conditioning and my automatic response is it can, even when it's really good, if I don't sit with it and like acknowledge it and I don't know what the word is, like give myself credit for it, of like, of course this good thing came your way. This is like a reflection of what you've been working at and all those sort of things. And I mean, it feels a lot like inner child work where I'm like, good job, little buddy. You've done it. Good job, little 4-year-old. Um, it can swing without me really noticing the progress. I just notice once I'm there, it can swing to the other side of like the imposter side of things, right? Where it's like, yes,
Yes.
it's really good. So I hope you don't screw it up. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, voice.
Yeah.
So I think that that is really hard for me. And like, I feel a little bit more sure about myself when I'm in reaction to the hurried, fast pace. That's very clear when that's misaligned for me.
Okay.
But when it's good and it's exciting, I really have to like stop myself and be like, you're allowed to enjoy this high and you're allowed to ride this roller coaster.
Yeah.
But like maybe don't make it your whole identity. Like
Yeah.
maybe don't lean into it quite so hard.
Yeah.
Just sort of sit with it and ride it.
Yeah.
And then once you're on the other side of the like initial high,
Mm-hmm.
then you can respond from that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I kind of wish that we had had this conversation like 2 or 3 years ago, because I think you swing to the imposter and I swing to the like you're not allowed.
Mm.
Like, I grew up in a family where, like, I was told that, it's really cute if you want a career, but you're
Mm.
not going to be, you're going to marry a husband and he's going to be the primary breadwinner. And, you know, like, you can work, but that's for fun,
Yeah. It's your
you
cute
know?
little hobby.
Yeah, it's my cute little hobby. And the first month that Empowered Curiosity, my cute little hobby, brought in 10 grand, which I had been working for a very long time and had been this, like, looking back on it, it's like there were so many more important things to be aiming for.
Fair.
But, everybody says this is
That's
what
a
that's a
milestone.
milestone
Yeah.
that people are find really important.
Yeah.
And I spent that money, like, I don't even know where that money went.
That's a whole other podcast you and I could have. But the highs and lows of money exchanges. And like, wow, I did so good. And where did it go?
Yeah.
Let me get out my handy spreadsheet and face the music.
Yeah. And I think that if I had had that moment of pause,
Mm-hmm.
where I could actually, in that pause, like, celebrate and have a moment of reflection,
Mm-hmm.
and have a moment where, I could actually just, like, step into that.
Yeah.
Part of it too is, like, I also felt bad talking about my success because I saw a lot of my friends who were also trying to build businesses struggling. And so
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to be saying,
Seems boastful.
yeah,
Which I think might be like something we're either directly or inadvertently told as women.
yeah,
Is like, I think that that's my imposter syndrome on a big level, is that like, shh, sit down.
yeah,
Like that's what mine tells me a lot.
totally.
And it's like, why?
Yeah.
Like, and same thing of like, certainly boasting can come from a misaligned place and from like a really aggressive, in your face type
Mm-hmm.
perspective.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's that both and.
Yeah.
Whereas I always want to see those things, especially around money, as like and or. You're either
Yeah.
making it or you're not. Like you're either rich or you're poor.
Yeah.
Like it's either this or the outcome is you're going to be homeless living on the street. Like
Yeah.
I have like one of those really weird voices in my brain where I'm
Right.
like, no, nothing in between
Yeah.
voice. Okay. Not sure that that's reality of it's either this or that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for a lot of us, that's a loud voice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's a voice that, like, as you said earlier, we have to go back to our inner child, whether it is like being like, okay, good job, buddy,
Mm-hmm.
or like, just
Do it, little buddy.
giving that 4-year old a different story of like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I know dad told you that you were gonna be the one who, stays at home, even if you don't want to have kids. Like, you're the one who's gonna be the secondary income.
Mm-hmm.
Guess what? You don't have to live that.
Yeah.
And we get to redo that story. That's not truth. That is somebody else's truth.
Yeah. And I think for me, this is a weird sort of example, but it's something I've really been even noticing in how I show up in the world physically, like body posture wise.
Mm,
Of it's probably indicative of where I grew up, which again, I'll try not to dive too deep into, but I think I can really see it in my own body posture of like I can see myself shrinking away and trying to like you don't deserve this or you can't do it this way. And the like concept of like actually sitting up straight and like squaring my shoulders,
mm-hmm.
I think I've always interpreted that as aggressive. Like aggressive and like
Mm.
this isn't the right word, but like a masculine feature, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
wide shoulders, broad shoulders.
yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
you can't show up in the world this way. And when you do, all that signals is you're ready to fight or like aggression. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, that's something I've really had to like use as one of my keys. As if something's coming up and I start doing this, I'm like, oh, what are you doing here, little buddy? Like, straighten your back, put your shoulders back. Like, it doesn't mean you're coming for their jugular, and it doesn't mean you're
Yeah,
exposing yours to their fangs.
yeah,
You can just actually stand firm in it.
yeah, yeah. And like, to me, I think that this is where the work of boundaries actually begins, is
Mm.
that internal process of like holding the strength, holding that inner, conversation of like, okay, like, you're okay, you're
Mm-hmm.
safe, you get to do this, you're allowed to do this,
Yeah.
and oftentimes I think that when we talk about boundaries, it's like about being against somebody,
Yep.
like almost there's like a
Push.
push energy to it.
Yep.
And the more and more I do work with boundaries, it is really just more about staying anchored in your own space
Yep.
and making sure that when somebody goes over the line, that it's not in like an aggressive push sort of a way, but
Mm-hmm.
it's like, that's not okay,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
That doesn't meet my expectations.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I think, I don't know. I don't know if this is personal or this is the way it always goes, but I think boundaries for me always felt so rigid that in order to be accommodating and seen as like a team player and collaborative and all those sort of things, I always thought I had to violate my own boundaries. And then when I first
Mm,
set them up, it was like a hard line of like, your toes on the line, back up.
yeah.
And I think I'm still massaging it, but I think I've sort of feel like you always have to go back to them. Like it's a bit like a values exercise of like, does this still feel right? And like, what's my I feel like it's a negotiation thing, right? Of like, what's my main ask, which is X amount over my actual like medium where I feel balanced.
Sure.
What's my medium one, and then what's my walk away price? And
Yeah.
not that it has to do with price, but I feel like numbers is just easier to categorize it.
Yeah.
That I think I'm forever surprised by that of like that there can be some fluidity to your boundaries, but then you have to know when, okay, there was a red flag there, there was a red flag there, and there's a misunderstanding here.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get very
Mm-hmm.
clear again of where this starts and stops.
Yeah.
Because I have this like, it's not how I work, but I have this interesting sort of perspective on the other people I'm interacting with of
Yeah.
like, I have this weird understanding of like, well, no, I've told you my boundary once, so you get it. It's like, well, no, but they have their
Mm,
own boundary and they're trying to figure out what works for them too.
yeah.
And so just mentioning it once probably isn't how it will ever work.
Yeah.
And so trying to sort of reiterate that at multiple steps along the way has been this very fascinating thing. And I think for me, I'm such an observer as I've had to watch it happen for other people
Yeah.
and to be like, oh, that person repeats that message like 18 times in
Yeah.
so many different ways. And people are still resonating with that. Whereas there's something, it might be a people pleasing tendency, I don't know, where there's something about it where it's like, don't annoy people. That's,
Mm,
you don't need to say it again. You've said it once. Shh, sit down. And
mm,
it's like that weird, like, be quiet, sit down, play small sort of
yeah,
voice is repetitive for me.
yeah,
And so I think, again, I have to sit with that lots and be like, you're allowed to say it more than once.
yeah,
You're allowed to say, like, no, no, we talked about this, and I'm
yeah,
going to reiterate this at this stage of this process.
yeah, yeah. I think that that goes into, you know, when you aren't able to hold up your own boundaries, of
Mm.
this concept around now it's turned into resentment. And
Yes.
like, it's like, I think oftentimes the way that boundaries are talked about is like you said, you know, you say it once, or there's an expectation set, and then we don't negotiate that ever again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this goes in line with, you know, some of the conversations I've been having around consent and marketing and things like that, where
Mm.
it's like, you know, the conversation around boundaries is just that, it's a conversation,
Yes.
you know. And
It's not a checkbox.
yeah, exactly.
There's a weird part of me that wants it to be a checkbox.
Yeah,
Like, I just want to be like, no, no, we all signed that contract. You all checked that terms and conditions.
right,
Never speaking about it again.
right. And
It's not how it
in
works.
reality, in like real time with real people and relationships,
Yeah.
it is, you know, part of the responsibility of holding boundaries is making sure that you take the responsibility of being understood,
Hmm.
you
Yep.
know.
Yep. No, I agree. And like my nerdy, like analytic systems brain loves being able to be like, how else can you put that message into
Mhm.
your process?
Mhm.
And where else do you need to remind
Yeah.
both yourself and other people? Because I think that that's been the flip side of boundaries for me is I've had these experiences where I've said, here's my boundary. Here's what I need. I'm finally asking for my worth. And somebody's gone, yeah, no problem. I've been like, yeah, like this feels great. And then I get to the other side of it and I have to be very cautious not to overexert myself
Mm.
from an excited point of view.
Yeah, yeah,
Of being like, no, you set that boundary for sustainability so
yeah.
that you
Yeah.
have the, I don't know what the word is, the like momentum and the like pace to get yourself through all the seasons, not just this one of excited high burn.
Sure.
And I think that that's been the interesting part for me because I think the boundary conversation always seems external,
Mhm.
but then it's very interesting to apply it to yourself too. Of
Mhm.
like, no, no, this applies to you too. You don't get to exert yourself just because you're excited and
Yeah.
because something's great.
Yeah.
You have to also hold yourself to your own standards.
Mhm. Absolutely. Um, can I ask you to tell a story that you told me a couple days ago over ramen?
Sure, but you're gonna have to remind me. My goldfish brain has no recollection.
That's okay. I'm having trouble remembering the exact words, but you were talking about a conversation you were having with a friend, maybe not a friend, but a conversation you were having, and they said a phrase that really pissed you off.
Mm.
Um,
Oh, no recollection.
it was something about, oh gosh, this is gonna drive me crazy now because, like, I don't want to butcher the phrase, but it was something about like lack of boundaries is lack of confidence, or
Oh, yeah, yeah.
what was
That
that
was
phrase?
actually a therapist I started working with
Okay.
when I first left my 9 to 5 job. And, oh, sorry, she, she said, your willingness to accommodate people actually signals an ineptitude.
Mm.
And I was so, she was like this very brash British person, and like I so appreciate how British people can just get to the damn point, but I don't know how to navigate it where I'm like, there's not enough pleases and thank yous and fluffy words. Like, you just said it, it's uncomfortable. And so I originally really hated it, and I went home and I journaled about it, and it was weeks later that I kind of landed on the like, when you are trying to accommodate everyone and make everyone happy, the only thing that happens is people question whether or not you know what you're talking about, because you're kind of
Mm-hmm.
flipping and flopping and saying, well, we could do this or this could happen. And you almost devalue your expertise,
Yeah.
I think is a nice way to summarize that.
Yeah.
And God, I hated it. But then I actually said it to somebody else that I was having a quite frustrating interaction with.
Yeah.
And I know this person, so I knew that it was like the best of intentions and they were trying to be supportive and create this environment where I could feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no idea of how it landed with the person other than they still talk to me, so they can't be that mad. But yeah, I think I don't think I had ever saw it that way. I
Mm-hmm.
think especially when you I feel like I have a different persona in a
Yeah.
workplace,
Yeah.
and I try not to bring that into my creativity, but there's this dance between creativity and making it authentic. Yeah, there's this forever dance of I need things to be official and follow a process and be legitimate to help me with my own boundaries.
Yeah.
Um but then I also get it mixed up with this like persona I've created to exist in the world when I am an employee.
Yeah.
And so I think I've been so focused on the like team side of things, and I think as a personality trait, I don't think so much at this stage of my life, but when I was entering the workforce, I was quite like aggressive and reactive and probably wouldn't be titled a good team player.
Okay.
And so I think I've created this persona that like overcompensates for that.
Mm.
And so I think
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I had ever realized how that looks to anyone other than like, no, I'm checking the boxes. You said I have to be
Mm-hmm.
a team player.
Yeah.
You say I have to take into consideration other people's
Yeah.
feelings. And so it was a eye-opening experience of that. I should write that sentence down and put it on a sticky somewhere.
Or in like sparkly
I got another sparkle banner.
sparkle banner.
Keep that one Etsy shop in business. Oh my god, what if I become that person that just has multiple sparkle banners? I could kind of get behind it.
Yeah. Um, I think the way that I see this playing out in, you know, service-based entrepreneurship is I actually answered this question on a forum that I'm on. Um, and it's it's so easy to fall into this trap of thinking, you know, I'm going to accommodate everybody by listing out all of my skills, all of my services on my website. You know, this person I was answering the question for is a virtual assistant.
Mm.
And I went on her website just to like peep what she was talking about because she was asking for some advice. And it was overwhelming, like the menu
Yes.
of things
Agree.
that she can do.
Yeah.
And I think it is so much more clear when you can get really clear about who you are meant to serve
Mm-hmm.
and then like what kind of problems or support you can provide,
Yeah.
you know, problems you're solving, support you can provide.
Yeah.
And then the method almost doesn't matter,
I agree.
you know?
I feel like the method, at least for me, when I start getting rambly or listing out too many things or using too many words, typically it's me trying to justify or validate my own, like, I belong in this arena. That's how
Yeah.
it comes
Yeah.
out for me.
Yeah. I'm
And
worthy.
yeah, exactly. And I struggle with that. And I had somebody redo my website maybe like 2 years ago, and she pared it way down, and I was like, but we're losing the essence of me, we're losing this. And now, I mean, I still have that website, but it's not active in the background. Now that I compare my old website to my new website that has very little verbiage, I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I see.
Yeah.
We are just standing firm in my art speaking for itself and
Yeah.
attracting the people, instead of being like, let me tell you about all the ways that I'm worthy and valuable and competent and all these things, where I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that was the messaging I was putting out there. And
Yeah.
I think lots of time, I mean, think that's probably what art does too, right?
Yeah.
Of like it reflects back a truth. And I think that that's the most lovely part for me as a photographer. When people are like, that's me? I'm like, yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
you. When
Yeah.
you're like settled into yourself, you're grounded, you're just free to play.
Mm-hmm.
That's who you are. That's how the rest of us see you.
Mm-hmm.
That I've had to do a little bit of the same type of letting other people reflect back to me of like, no,
Mm.
no, this is enough. You don't have to bring all that to the
Yeah.
table. You don't have to say all those things. And typically it's just noise. Like in a 9 to 5 job that I used to have as well, we used to talk about this all the time of like, there's expert level when you are so knowledgeable and you have such a skill set that you can do the thing, like
Yeah.
that is expert.
Yeah.
But a true expert is being able to take these very complex things that have taken decades to learn and master and explain it to a grade 2 or 3 child.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there was some dynamics at play there in my job that made that a very obvious situation that we had to translate that. But I feel like anytime there's a lot of words, a lot of context, a lot of explaining,
Uh-huh.
it's like that means nothing except to you as the expert.
Yeah.
The rest of us have no idea what that means.
Yeah. And I think that it goes back to this concept of like accommodation, because it's coming at, an emotional process for a lot of people. Because oftentimes when you're hiring somebody's services, whether it's photography or a coach or, a Reiki healer or really any kind of service,
Mm-hmm.
like you're asking for expertise. And I think that a lot of times people are thinking that modality demonstrates expertise.
Mm.
And to me, now that I have this like nervous system nerd hat like lingo,
Mm-hmm.
it's really about safety.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
And so, what you're speaking to, of there being a lot of verbiage, a lot of like justification, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of like, no, but let me tell you about all the processes and the
Mm-hmm.
methods and all the tools that I use. What I'm hearing in that is you actually don't feel safe as a practitioner.
Right.
And so, me as a client, I feel that as like a bit of a dissonance.
Interesting. That makes sense.
And so, it's about like, can you settle into your nervous system and feel safe within your own value,
Yeah.
within your own skill set? If I were to list out every, modality and method that I use within BAM, it would take up the entire sales page. And instead, I talk about who my person is, what kind of problems you're struggling with, and how I can understand and
Yeah.
help you. That's a much more succinct website.
Yeah. The how doesn't even really matter.
Yeah.
No, and I think that that's actually like as you're talking, I'm thinking about my own process. And I think that like settling into your nervous system, that is why my process is so slow. And that's why I need to take it slow
Mm,
because I have a whole process, even like the drive to a shoot.
yeah.
I have all these little rituals and things I do to make sure that I show up and that I can hold
Yeah.
space. And then I realize that there's a real clear disassociation between if I'm using a ton of words and a ton of justification in my actual session, I don't actually talk to the person a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of what I'm doing is just watching a person move, watching a person play around.
Yeah.
And so there's, to me, it makes it very obvious of what a gap
Yeah.
there is between when I'm feeling the need to justify what
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing versus what actually happens.
Mm-hmm.
That's not actually aligned.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that, you know, that drew me to your energy. I don't know that you had the like clarity to like talk about it in this context back then,
Mm-hmm.
but I had come from, I was a part-time model at one point in my life. It sounds stupid to say that, but
It's real.
I had done a lot of modeling gigs where it was rooted in sympathetic, where it was like, we have 20 minutes,
Yeah.
we have 40 minutes,
God, I hate
we
that.
need to get
Mini
X amount
sessions.
of, yeah, we need to get X amount of shots in. And so, like, we're going to contort your body into these weird positions to get the angles that we need
Yep.
to showcase whatever it is that we're selling. And it was such a different process with you, where it was like we had the whole day,
Yeah.
you know, we got to really connect and talk to each other.
Yep.
You gave me a lot of time to like actually just settle into my own nervous system. And at the end of the day, it was really just like me having fun in nature and, just.
No, you actually highlighted something for me because I look at other photographers who work with like real models,
Mm.
real, like hired professionals, and there's something that doesn't resonate with me, and I can't ever pinpoint it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, I mean, it could go a lot of different ways, but ultimately, I don't know that I ever saw it that way. That there's isn't that settling into your, like it's very posed and they know the process, and I think that that would be very cool to take them out into a situation like this and be like, okay, but do that, but also be you. But thank you, because I couldn't really identify why I felt so misaligned with that, of like, was that imposter syndrome and like I can't work with real models. I wasn't sure if that was the reasoning, and I think hearing you explain the process that way that I'm not super familiar with, it makes me realize that's the misalignment, is that they're working from a completely different point of view. And I don't even know that I would know what to do with that. I'd be like, you look great. I don't know how to take your photo.
I mean, you're working with like basically like a trained body, who doesn't know how to do anything outside of that training.
Yeah. And like, I really think that some of the best scenes, some of the best shots, some of the best moments come from somebody literally goofing off.
Yeah.
So many times it's somebody who's like, what about this? And I'm like, kind of. But like, don't make your face like that next time. Like, relax your face and do that again.
Yeah.
And I'm making giant assumptions here, but I watch how structured a model actually is. And I'm like, I don't know that they could do that. I think there certainly are people who could do both.
Yeah.
But I think this is just making me realize that's probably my resistance to those circumstances of like, sure, we could be run and gun and we could do 20 minutes and we could hire out a studio, but there's a misalignment, a feeling that doesn't align for me.
Yeah. And there's also something about your process that asks us on the other side of the camera to step into the sovereignty and like unique movement of your own body, because you don't give very much direction.
No.
And then it requires me to be like, okay, so then how do I want to move?
Yeah.
Versus like when I was in traditional modeling, it was like very specific to the point of like, move your elbow 1 centimeter this way, or like,
more power to you.
Yeah.
But if that part of my brain engages, nothing about like flow and ease is part of that process.
Exactly. And so part of, aligning and having a parasympathetic photo shoot, for lack of a better phrase.
I'm changing my website description immediately.
Is you're asking people to step into their own bodies instead of having their bodies manipulated for them. And again, not for everybody, and again, this sort of goes back to our conversation earlier about niching, is like, not everybody's gonna want that.
Exactly.
And you have to be solid in your own conviction of how you want your art to be, to say that's okay. I'm not everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah.
And the people who are really going to get a lot of value out of this are still going to find me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. And I even feel that way about, I work with some other photographers and we've done some projects, and at the end of it, they're like jazzed and revved up. Whereas I go home from a session and I'm like, and fetal position. I just need to cocoon back into my place and rest. And I have this whole like after process of like, I back up the photos, but I don't look at them for a long time. And then when I do go through the first sort of cull to pick the ones that I am going to edit, I have to be in a really right space to sort of like trust the process and trust what I intuitively feel as the ones I want to keep. That I think Yeah, I don't know that I've really realized that there's sort of that exchange for me too, and that
Hmm.
that makes my process a little bit different.
Hmm.
Of yeah, we just drove home from the island with two other photographers, and they were just like, "Yeah!" And I was in the back seat, literally staring at the floor, and they're like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, I get it. This is like, this revs you guys up as extroverts. I was like, as an introvert, I was like, I like you. I'm listening. I was like, and I'm like processing, and I'll write you an email tomorrow about all my opinions. I'm like, but I just like, I was like, I'm not sad despite what my face might look like. I was like, I'm also not angry despite how crinkled my face looks right now.
Yeah.
I just need the time to like cocoon away after all of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that I would love for us collectively to start valuing more is slow,
Mm-hmm.
you
Me
know.
too. It feels so rich to me. And like I feel like I show up with another layer after that.
Hmm.
Whereas if I just keep pushing, I just deplete.
Yeah.
I just deplete to the point that I'm in the fetal position wondering like, how did I get here?
Yeah. Yeah. And with that like fast-paced energy, it's harder to tell when you've gone off track,
Mm-hmm.
you know. It's easier to make a 180-degree move if you need to
Mm-hmm.
when you're going at like a walk versus when you're going at a run.
Exactly. Yeah. I just run into a wall and then I'm surprised that there's a wall whenever
Yeah.
I'm running.
Yeah.
Whereas I can sort of see things coming, and I think that's one of the great things is there's like five or six people I've found that do similar work but not the same,
Hmm.
and we've been able to kind of like bounce ideas off of each other, and just their descriptive process about how they're slowing things down and
Yeah.
why that's important has just been so lovely to like hear someone else vocalize that, not only as like a reassurance that like,
Hmm.
okay, good, someone else is feeling this way,
Yeah.
but also of just like, oh, I would have never described it that way, thank you, that's such a
Yeah.
great way of reflecting it.
Yeah. And it's something that I think, you know, we should all be embracing in whatever field we're in. And I also recognize where it feels really threatening to embrace that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because in my work, it's like, yeah, people want to get to that 10K month, that 100K
Right.
year, like really, really quickly.
Yes.
And yes, I want that for you. But also, if we're going to talk about capitalism, if we're going
Mm-hmm.
to talk about toxic market strategies or toxic marketing strategies, yes, I can speak. And we're going to talk about ethics and values. We can't want all those things infused into our business
Mm-hmm.
and also want it to be super, super fast.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those are two dichotomous ideas.
Yeah.
And I posted about this on Instagram the other day. It did not like most of the time I get some sort of like good interaction from my audience.
Mm-hmm.
This was one of the like meh, mehs.
No thank you, I would like all the 10K months unfollow. And I get it, but I feel like you're missing the sweetness of the process when you're only focused on the end result.
Yeah.
And I'm in that same boat, so it's not like I'm out here rowing some peaceful thing.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's the lesson in it of
Yeah.
like, if everything showed up to you this instantly and it was this quick part, you would miss all the sweetness of like, what else is there
Yeah.
within this to celebrate or
Yeah.
to examine or to never do again
Yeah.
or whatever the layers of it is. And I think that's the sadness of how like instant everything in our life has been, or how everything's like a highlight reel
Yeah.
of like, you're missing the whole process through it, and you're missing the fact that like, yeah, I showed you that,
Mm-hmm.
but you also didn't see the 7 attempts,
Yeah.
or the fact that I was out there for an hour and 45 minutes for that one photo,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever it is, right? I think
Yeah.
that you can simplify it down that way too.
Yeah.
And
And I think for me, it's like it comes down to I if you're gonna put in this much effort into a thing that you love,
mm-hmm.
I would love for that process, for that end result to be a sustainable thing at the end of the day,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
And to be aligned.
Yeah.
I think that This is an awful joke to make, but I always make it of like that's my protection around my photography business is that I want it to be something that's like sweet and nourishing and aligned for me, even
Mm-hmm.
if that means I'm not the photographer making $500,000 a year off of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm going to be an HR nightmare and I'm going to be awful and difficult to work with, blah, blah, of like if that's who I'm going to end up being in this business at the end, then I'm going to go work for somebody else who has a whole HR department and I can be their problem. Like I don't want to be my own HR department nightmare at the end of it.
That's fair. Yeah, and I think that we're sold these quick hot flash sort of fixes, or this is how you can get to.
Yeah. And it's so appealing.
Yeah.
I follow somebody who I think 90% of the time is super aligned and I'm super into her offerings. And I'm like, yes, like you're the guru, you're the savior I'm looking for. And then she does something very human. And I'm like, oh, how dare you fall off that pedestal? And I'm like, but this is why her services aren't your services. If you're looking for a guru, that's already your problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And it's like if you're going to put in all that effort into this thing that you love anyway, don't you want it to last?
Mm-hmm.
And if you burn yourself out in the first 6 months of putting this all together, I feel like that's just such a waste.
Agree.
And so if we can sink into what you were talking about, which is like the sweetness of the process, and that sweetness can come in really hard packages sometimes.
Yep. Harsh lessons and sort of like brutal situations.
Yeah.
But they all end up having the sweetness of a lesson in the end where you're like, that's what that was for.
Yeah, totally. And I think that we need to have that slow part of our culture infused in with these sweet lessons.
Yeah.
For it to be sustainable. I don't think we can build sustainable businesses otherwise.
And I don't know what that balance is yet. Like I'm kind of toying with some different sort of strategies of like, is it looking at it in terms of like seasons or even stages of a fire? Is that what is going to be easiest to sort of plan around and like balance yourself to?
Mm-hmm.
And then, there's some other sort of like thoughts brewing of like, I don't know what the word is. But I think for me, the thing I'm always forever surprised about is like imbalance can come from excitement or goodness too.
Yeah.
Of like, I think that's always my surprise is I always want it to be negative, aggressive, like all those sort of, there's this category of boundaries and this category of resistance.
Yeah.
And I think that there's always this like surprise season of life for me where it's like, I know, but you can also slam too much goodness into one spot where you exhaust yourself, and that's not sustainable either.
Totally.
And so like, how do you start to like recognize those patterns, set those boundaries, and then have those conversations where you're like, you are a heck yes, but not right now.
Yeah.
I can't slam you into this season simply because I'm excited.
Yeah. Yeah. Titration.
Sure. Never heard that word before.
Little bits at a time.
Oh, I like that. Right? And like that makes me think of like sap or honey or stuff of like, like something that like that slow goodness or like slow roasted vegetables or whatever it is of like that flavor and depth and layers and intensity can only come from that slowness.
Yeah.
And like you can mimic it and you can boil all the sugars you want and do all the things, but it never tastes the same as that like slow made, not processed side of things.
Yeah, I love that because it's like, you're right, like, you can roast vegetables over the course of multiple hours and you come up with this like beautiful thing. You can't just slam it in the oven and have it ready in 30 minutes.
There is no 1980s microwavable dish that tastes the same. I took a journaling course a little while ago, and she talked about the stages of a fire, how it's like the 4 stages of like ignition, it's like ignition and spark, and then burn, and then like full burn, like all your resources are in, and then like the slow dwindling ember stage.
Yep.
And talked about how, because it had to do with the seasons of the year too, and so it was like September has the word ember in it, November has the word ember in it, December, and then she was like, let's just pretend October does too for the sake of this working. But just talking about how, you know, you look at that and you look at that fire and you think, but it's not full on and it's not everything.
Yeah.
But when you sort of move everything out of the way, those embers are still under there, and it's actually the hottest stage of the fire, and that's the stage of the fire that like slow roasts and cooks and marinates and does all those like rich juicy things that we love for food.
Yeah.
But if you just look at it, it's never as fancy or showy or incredible as like the full-on burn stage. Like, that's an amazing part of it.
For sure.
But it's that like cocooning back in and coming back down into it.
Yeah.
So that those things can come.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I talk about, you know, business being a seasonal practice. And I'm in the process of getting this new group of BAM onboarded right now, and it's a different pace for people, because people are often, especially in a business course, you're often, you know, let's hit the ground running and like just go. And we start out in metal season or fall, and it's like a slow burn. You know, we start out at a very, very slow pace, and I can see people's nervous systems, A, not knowing what to do with it, and B, being like, okay, I want to go. Like that, like racehorse sort of energy.
This has always been like the confusion for me too, of like, you know, at least in North America, like the school season starts in September, and like it always seems like this ignition part at a time where I'm like, no, I want to lay down. Why are we all starting a race? That I feel like there's like this weird misalignment, or this like feeling of like, January 1st is coming, now's the time to knock it out of the park with all the things you said you'd do this year. And that feels very misaligned to me, and yet I get wrapped up in it as well.
Yeah, of course. And it's like, you know, the reason why we start out slow is because we all know how to do the fast. And so in that slowness, in that you know, making sure that we're sinking into the sweetness and the juiciness is actually clarity. There's a sense of like being able to root down, being able to like actually see what your values are, because you're not being rushed to like make a decision about your business right fucking now. And so, you know, we will go into a spring season with the BAM curriculum and in our seasons where you do get to like have a lot of like external things come out, but if all that external stuff comes out before you've had a chance to align with your values and what you stand for, then it can come off as being really performative.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Well, my dear, is there anything else you want to add to this meandering journey around boundaries?
No, not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Feels complete.
Yeah, I like this, because I didn't really know what we were going to talk about other than
I never know
boundaries.
what we're going to talk about.
That it's kind of nice to be like, this is all boundaries. It's all included.
Yeah, I never know what we're going to talk about, so.
Fair. I've never been on a podcast, so thank you for having me and not making this experience as scary as my brain told me it was going to be.
Not scary.
It's not scary.
Well, Jenna, how can people find you in the world of the internets?
In the World Wide Web. You can find me at jennapullen.com, which is my website, or I'm on social media, mostly just Instagram, really, at Jenna Pullen Photography. And it's Pullen, since that's very confusing for people.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for recording this with me, for being my buddy friend. And now we're just going to go for a walk in the woods.
Yay!